The sharp chill of winter hung in the air, the forest blanketed in a thick layer of pristine snow. Frost clung to the branches of pine trees, their dark green needles providing the only splash of color in an otherwise white world. Deep within the forest, a grizzly bear lumbered quietly, its massive frame leaving heavy tracks in the snow. This was a harsh and untamed place where survival demanded strength and instinct. The grizzly, with its thick winter coat and powerful build, moved as though searching for something, or someone. Among the snow-covered trees, the bear paused. Its dark eyes scanned the frozen landscape, nostrils flaring as it caught a faint scent carried by the cold wind. This was no ordinary day. The bear's journey was tied to a memory buried deep within its being, one of warmth, safety, and a human it had not seen for years. At the edge of the forest, nestled against the backdrop of towering mountains, stood a small cabin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a soft promise of warmth against the biting cold. Inside, Helen was busy stacking firewood near the hearth. Now, in her mid-60s, Helen had chosen this remote life after retiring from years in the bustling town. Her hands, worn but steady, carried the marks of a life lived with purpose and resilience. Helen paused, brushing snowflakes off her jacket as she gazed out the frost-covered window. The forest stretched endlessly before her, its quiet beauty a constant source of solace. Years ago, it had given her something more than peace. It had given her a connection that forever changed her life. She had saved a young bear cub, injured and alone, nursing it back to health and releasing it into the wild. That winter had been one of the most profound experiences of her life, leaving an indelible mark on her heart. Though she rarely spoke of it, Helen often wondered what had become of the cub she once called Sam. Did he survive the harshness of the wild? Would he even remember her? As she stared at the edge of the forest, a strange feeling washed over her, a faint sense of anticipation she couldn't explain. Later that afternoon, Helen wrapped herself in a thick coat, pulling on her boots before stepping outside. The crisp air bit at her cheeks as she trudged through the snow, a basket of apples and bread in hand. It was a habit she had adopted over the years, leaving food for the forest's creatures during the harsh winters. The familiar crunch of snow underfoot accompanied her as she made her way to a clearing she had visited countless times before. The clearing was as she remembered. A serene expanse surrounded by towering pines, the snow sparkling under the pale winter sun. She set the basket down near her favorite spot, a large boulder dusted with frost. Sitting on the edge of the rock, Helen took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the forest calm her. Then she heard it, a low, rustling sound that broke the silence. Helen froze, her heart quickening. She turned her head toward the noise, her breath visible in the cold air as she waited. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, until a figure emerged from the trees. Her breath caught as she saw the grizzly bear step into the clearing. Its massive form was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, the snow crunching beneath its weight. Helen's first instinct was fear, her body tensing as she considered retreating. But something about the bear stopped her. Its movements were calm, its dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt strangely familiar. "Sam?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The bear paused, tilting its head slightly at the sound of her voice. Helen's heart raced as the realization dawned on her. This was no ordinary grizzly. It was the cub she had saved all those years ago, now grown into a powerful adult, but somehow still connected to her. Tears welled in her eyes as the bear let out a soft huff, its breath visible in the frigid air. Against all odds, it had found her again, The years of separation seemed to melt away in that moment, replaced by a profound sense of recognition and gratitude. Helen reached into her basket, pulling out an apple and holding it out with trembling hands. The bear took a cautious step forward, its massive paws sinking into the snow. Slowly, it closed the distance between them, its movements deliberate yet unthreatening. When it stopped a few feet away, Helen's breath caught. She could see the intelligence in its eyes, a depth that spoke of memory and trust. She extended the apple further, her voice trembling as she said, "It's you, isn't it? You remember." The bear lowered its head, gently taking the apple from her hand. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, human and bear, their bond unbroken despite the years apart. The frozen forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the connection between them more powerful than words could ever express. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in hues of gold and pink, Helen sat with Sam in the clearing. It was a reunion neither of them had expected, but one that felt destined. The harshness of winter, the years of separation, all faded in the warmth of that moment. A reminder of the extraordinary bond they shared. The winter air hung heavy with silence as Helen and the bear sat in the snow-covered clearing. The scene felt surreal, like a memory brought to life after years of dormancy. Sam, the once injured cub she had nursed through a bitter winter long ago, was now a towering grizzly. Yet something in his posture and gaze told her he still remembered. Helen reached into her basket again, pulling out another apple. She held it out with steady hands, her breath visible in the cold air. Sam hesitated for a moment, his large paw crunching the snow as he took a step closer. His massive frame was imposing, yet his movements carried a gentleness that eased her nerves. "You've grown so much," Helen whispered, her voice soft but trembling with emotion. "I always wondered what became of you." Sam took the apple delicately from her hand, his warm breath brushing against her glove. The simple gesture stirred memories Helen had tried to push aside over the years. The long nights spent caring for the fragile cub, feeding him milk from a bottle, and dressing the wound on his leg. She remembered the moment she had to release him back into the wild, watching as he disappeared into the trees, hoping he would survive, but knowing he would never again belong to her world. "You found me," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "After all this time, you came back." Sam let out a low rumble, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that felt almost human. Helen felt a lump rise in her throat as she reached out hesitantly, her gloved hand brushing against the thick fur of his shoulder. To her surprise, Sam didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the moment. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and snow. Helen wrapped her coat tighter around her, her thoughts racing. She couldn't explain how or why this reunion was happening, but it felt like a gift, an answer to the unspoken questions that had lingered in her heart since that fateful winter. After a few moments, Sam stepped back slightly, his large paw brushing against the basket Helen had set down. He sniffed at it curiously, his nose twitching as he investigated the contents. Helen chuckled softly, her fear now replaced by a sense of wonder. "You always had a good appetite," she said, reaching into the basket to offer him a piece of bread. Sam accepted the offering, his movements careful and deliberate. Helen watched him, marveling at how much he had changed and yet how much he seemed the same. His coat, thick and dark, shimmered with frost, and his powerful frame spoke of years spent surviving the harsh wilderness. But his eyes, those deep, expressive eyes, were a window to the bond they had once shared. As the sun dipped lower, painting the snowy clearing in hues of orange and pink, Helen realized how much time had passed. The chill was becoming sharper, and the forest seemed to grow quieter with the approach of evening. She hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Would Sam stay? Would he leave? She didn't want to end the moment, but she knew the wild was his home now. "You don't belong here with me," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I'm so glad you came back." Sam let out another soft rumble, his head tilting as if he understood her words. He moved closer again, lowering himself slightly so that his massive head was level with hers. For a moment, it felt like he was saying goodbye, not with words, but with the quiet, profound understanding that only animals could convey. Helen reached out once more, her hand resting gently on his fur. "Be safe out there," she whispered. "And remember, you'll always have a place in my heart." As if on cue, Sam stepped back, his large frame blending into the shadows of the trees. He turned once, his dark eyes meeting hers one last time before disappearing into the forest. Helen watched him go, her heart heavy yet full, the clearing feeling impossibly still without him. She sat there for a while, the snow crunching softly beneath her as she replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The bond she had shared with Sam, first as a helpless cub and now as a mighty grizzly, was something she couldn't fully explain. It was more than trust, more than gratitude. It was a connection forged in survival, one that transcended time and the boundaries of their worlds. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Helen finally stood, brushing snow from her coat. The cold nipped at her cheeks as she gathered her basket and turned back toward the cabin, her steps light despite the weight of her thoughts. She knew this reunion was a rare and extraordinary gift, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her days. The walk back to the cabin felt surreal to Helen. The fading light of day cast long shadows across the snow, and her breath formed soft clouds in the frosty air. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of the extraordinary encounter she had just experienced. As she approached her cabin, the warm glow from the windows was a comforting contrast to the icy wilderness behind her. She stepped inside, shutting out the cold, and set her basket on the table. The crackling of the fire filled the silence, but her thoughts remained on Sam. She sank into her favorite chair by the hearth, staring into the flames as memories from years ago flooded back. Helen could still remember the day she found Sam, or rather, the day he found her. A young cub, limping and crying, had stumbled onto her property during a brutal snowstorm. He had been terrified and weak, a small, fragile creature who likely wouldn't have survived another night in the cold. Despite her fear, grizzlies, even young ones, were dangerous. Helen couldn't ignore his plight. She had spent weeks nursing him back to health, her cabin becoming a makeshift sanctuary for the injured cub. Feeding him, tending to his wounds, and keeping him warm had been a labor of love, one that had formed an unbreakable bond between them. When spring arrived, Helen knew it was time to let him go. It was one of the hardest decisions she'd ever made, but she knew Sam belonged to the wild. Now, years later, seeing him again had reopened a part of her heart she thought had been closed forever. He remembered, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. All this time, and he still remembered. Helen rose from her chair and moved to the small shelf where she kept her most cherished belongings. Among the trinkets and photographs was a worn leather journal she had kept during that winter with Sam. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her entries. The pages were filled with sketches of the cub, notes about his recovery, and heartfelt reflections on their time together. Flipping through the journal, Helen stopped at a drawing she had made of Sam's face, his small expressive eyes, and the slight tilt of his head. She smiled through her tears, the memory so vivid it felt as though she had stepped back in time. "You've grown so much," she murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. "But you're still the same." The journal entry on the next page caught her attention. It was one she had written the day Sam had left. The words were smudged as if by tears, but she could still make them out. "I hope you find your place in the world, my brave boy, and if fate is kind, perhaps one day our paths will cross again." Helen closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, her heart full of gratitude. Fate had indeed been kind, giving her a moment she never dared to dream of. She sat quietly for a while, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls as she reflected on the depth of the bond she and Sam had shared. It wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, love, and the unspoken understanding that connected them across time and distance. Later that evening, as she prepared for bed, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that this reunion was more than a chance encounter. Sam's appearance felt purposeful, as though he had come back not just to thank her, but to remind her of something she had forgotten: the profound impact one act of kindness could have. She glanced out the window one last time before drawing the curtains. The forest was quiet, the moonlight illuminating the snow-covered trees. Helen wondered if Sam was still out there, watching from the shadows. The thought brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "Good night, Sam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Be safe out there." As Helen drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of her time with Sam, the young cub curled up by the fire, his playful antics as he regained his strength, and the quiet bond they had shared. The reunion in the clearing felt like a continuation of that story, a reminder that some connections could never truly be broken. Outside, the forest settled into its own quiet rhythm. The Grizzly, now far from the clearing, moved steadily through the trees. His massive frame cast long shadows on the snow, but his steps were calm and deliberate. For Sam, the day's encounter had been more than a reunion. It was a return to the one place where he had felt truly safe. The next morning, the sun rose over a world still draped in winter's icy grip. Helen awoke to the soft golden light streaming through her cabin windows, her dreams of Sam lingering like a distant melody. She stretched and glanced toward the window, half hoping to see his familiar silhouette in the distance. But the forest appeared as still and quiet as ever, a blanket of untouched snow sparkling under the morning light. Helen moved to the hearth, stirring the embers of last night's fire and adding more wood. As the flames roared back to life, she thought about the impact Sam had made on her life, not just as a vulnerable cub, but now, years later, as a fully grown grizzly. His visit wasn't just a reunion, it was a reminder of the profound connections that existed between humans and the natural world. After breakfast, Helen decided to take another walk through the forest. She bundled herself in her warmest coat, her boots crunching softly against the snow as she retraced the path to the clearing. The memory of Sam's massive form emerging from the trees filled her with both awe and gratitude. As she walked, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that her bond with Sam extended beyond their shared history. She thought about how her decision to save him had likely shaped his survival, giving him the strength to navigate the harsh wilderness. But now it seemed as though Sam had returned the favor. His unexpected visit had rekindled something within her, a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she had lost. Reaching the clearing, Helen paused and scanned the tree line. The snow in the open space was marked by deep paw prints, evidence of Sam's presence the day before. She knelt beside one of the prints, her gloved hand brushing over its edges. It was enormous, a stark reminder of how much he had grown. Yet, there was still a sense of familiarity, as though the cub she had once held was still there, hidden beneath his powerful frame. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. The words weren't just for Sam, but for the experience itself, for the way it had reminded her of the beauty and resilience of life. As she stood, Helen noticed something glinting in the snow a few feet away. She moved closer, her curiosity piqued, and found a small object partially buried beneath the frost. Gently, she brushed the snow aside and uncovered a piece of bark with deep scratches etched into its surface. The marks weren't random. They looked intentional, almost like symbols or a pattern. Helen's heart raced as she realized the scratches could have been left by Sam. Could this be a message? She wasn't sure, but the thought warmed her nonetheless. She tucked the bark into her coat pocket and rose, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees one last time. Though Sam was nowhere to be seen, she felt his presence lingering in the forest, a quiet reassurance that their bond remained. The walk back to the cabin was quiet but peaceful. Helen thought about how every choice she had made, saving Sam, releasing him, and now cherishing his return, had rippled outward, creating a story that transcended time. It reminded her that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could leave lasting impacts in ways she couldn't always foresee. By the time Helen reached her cabin, the sun had climbed higher, melting the frost on the windows. She placed the bark on her kitchen table, studying its scratches as if they held secrets she needed to uncover. It didn't matter whether they were deliberate or accidental. What mattered was the connection they represented, a bridge between her world and Sam's. As the day unfolded, Helen found herself inspired in ways she hadn't been in years. She dusted off her old sketch pad and began drawing again, capturing the memory of Sam as he had appeared in the clearing, his massive form framed by snow-covered trees, his dark eyes filled with recognition and trust. Later that evening, as she sipped a warm cup of tea by the fire, Helen felt a deep sense of peace. Her reunion with Sam had reminded her that life was full of unexpected gifts, moments that reaffirmed the beauty of the connections we share with others, human or otherwise. Outside, the forest settled into the stillness of night. Somewhere among the towering trees, Sam roamed, his powerful strides leaving tracks that would soon be covered by fresh snow. But for Helen, those tracks, and the memories they represented, were indelible. They were a testament to the bond they had shared, a reminder that kindness, once given, could echo through time in ways that were nothing short of miraculous. The following days brought a sense of quiet fulfillment to Helen's life. Each morning, she woke with the hope that she might catch another glimpse of Sam. Though he didn't return, his memory lingered in every corner of her world. The clearing where they reunited, the faint paw prints left in the snow, and the scratches on the bark now carefully placed on her mantle. Winter continued its icy grip on the forest, but for Helen, the season no longer felt harsh. Instead, it carried a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a reminder of the incredible connection that transcended boundaries of species and time. Each day, she walked the same path to the clearing, leaving small offerings of apples and bread at the edge of the trees. Though Sam didn't appear, she felt his presence in the stillness of the woods, as if he was watching over her from afar. One morning, Helen awoke to an unexpected sight. Overnight, fresh snow had blanketed the forest, erasing all traces of footprints and paths. Yet, just outside her cabin, in the middle of the pristine snow, were paw prints, large and deliberate. Her heart raced as she stepped outside, following the tracks that led to her door and then back toward the forest. They stopped at the edge of the trees where the snow was undisturbed beyond. Helen stood there, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, her heart swelling with emotion. Though Sam hadn't revealed himself, this was his way of saying he hadn't forgotten her. It was his quiet goodbye, a promise that their bond would endure even if their paths didn't cross again. "Thank you," she whispered into the stillness, her voice carrying into the forest. "For everything." Back inside, Helen returned to her sketchpad. Her drawings of Sam grew more detailed with each passing day. His intelligent eyes, the curve of his powerful frame, the way the snow clung to his fur. She poured her memories into her art, capturing not just his image, but the feelings he had stirred within her. In the evenings, as she sat by the fire, Helen often thought about the lessons Sam had taught her. His unexpected return reminded her that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave a lasting impact. By saving him, she had given him a chance to survive. By returning, he had given her a renewed sense of purpose and connection. Helen began writing about their story, recording every detail she could remember. She wrote about the day she found him as a cub, the long winter they spent together, and the bittersweet moment when she let him go. Most importantly, she wrote about their reunion, the way he had recognized her after all those years, and the bond that had brought him back to her. As she finished her final entry, Helen felt a sense of closure. Their story wasn't over, but it had reached a chapter she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She placed the journal on her shelf beside the old one, the two volumes side by side like bookends to an incredible journey. The winter days stretched into weeks, and though Helen's life returned to its usual rhythm, she carried Sam's memory with her everywhere. Each trip to the forest, each quiet evening by the fire, reminded her of the profound connection they had shared. It was a bond that went beyond words, a testament to the power of compassion and the resilience of love. If this story of love, trust, and extraordinary bonds touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's celebrate the beauty of the connections we share with the world around us and the power of kindness to change lives.